It's important that the world's first university devoted to research was in Prussia, the University of Berlin, which was established in 1809. Its establishment illustrated the shift taking place from arts and literature to reason as the principal means for realizing in some clear, demonstrable way societal advancement and human progress. The University of Berlin legitimized the idea that universities, which would now be free from the traditional control and authority of the church, could provide leadership, could serve in society as an intellectual and political leader in society's march, in society's never-ending march towards a state of perfection. So research on the forefront. It came to play the cultural role that had previously been occupied by the arts, music, and literature under a system of patronage. Research now advancing the leading edge of progress. But, and this is a key point, especially for those who come out of traditions where the individual is important, the products of research benefit not just now the individual states, but for humanity in general. Science in particular. Emergent natural philosophy flourished at the University of Berlin, which I might point out provided a model for research universities in the United States. The first research university in the United States was Johns Hopkins. It was modeled directly on the University of Berlin. Now, establishment of this university also manifested a new connection between government and philosophy. Now, it's important to understand this link between government and philosophy, in part to be able to contrast the emergence of educational institutions in Germany with those in France. In relatively simple terms here, the philosophers gained responsibility and asserted their responsibility for articulating what reason was. What is reason? How do you recognize it when you're experiencing it? While the government, on the other side, found itself in charge of realizing reason in concrete practice. The University of Berlin, this illustrates the point, was established by an education reformer, Wilhelm von Humboldt. Humboldt established the university after he had witnessed lectures by a philosopher by the name of Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Now, who was Fichte here? Fichte was a philosopher who was very much interested in popularization. He produced works that were written for both his academic audiences, as the audience of philosophers, and for the public in general, the emergent reading public. He delivered a set of lectures in Berlin in 1807, which he titled Addresses to the German Nation. Now, it's important. This title is important in 1807 because in 1807 there was no German nation. Rather, what he was trying to do, and succeeded in doing, was initiating a philosophical movement to define Germanness, to define Germanness in opposition, as distinct from the long-term Roman heritage. And he strongly advocated the emergence of a German national consciousness, a self-consciousness about Germanness. And he made the case that philosophers were human tools for the Enlightenment. It was the job of philosophers to articulate reason, and hence through reason, what counts as Germanness. Their job then, the philosophers, shouldn't just live in an academic realm. They should be public intellectuals. They should be the teachers of mankind. And they should be superintendents of society's progress towards a state of perfection. So this philosopher, Fichte, argued that in order to survive, the Germans, they needed to assert their culture. They needed to assert their language. They needed to assert their way of thinking, or else they would suffer continued assimilation, or worse, submission to an external Roman culture. originating in the South. He framed his arguments in terms of a theory of history, an evolutionary theory of history that pictured it in a set of stages. And in terms of this evolutionary theory, he envisioned a form of national education, and a form of education that would be devoted to the unfolding of new ideas, whose appearance, the appearance of these new ideas, and their institutionalization would enable the German nation, which he was attempting to formulate, to reach the highest level of evolutionary development in his framework, a fifth stage, beyond the fourth stage at which society currently found itself. Now, in the audience here, Minister Humboldt was in a position to respond. And Fichte found himself, before long, as chair of philosophy and the first rector of the University of Berlin. Following him in the Berlin chair of philosophy was another philosopher, one who would become Germany's most prominent philosopher, by the name of Hegel. If you've ever heard this name, Hegel, it's probably linked in some way to three words, three words that are the key features of Hegel's form of dialectical reasoning. The three words being thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And by getting a feel for these three words, you can get a sense of Hegel's understanding of history overall and how society could and will develop. Hegel's argument was that history in general involved an unfolding, a realization of absolute reason. Absolute reason being formed very much in the image of God. And absolute reason would be unfolded, would be realized through an iteration of theses produced by humans over time. So, for example, the specific emergence of some sort of thesis about what life is in society, a thesis generated in the present, would, in principle, generate its opposite, a response over time, which he characterized as an antithesis. And then as time went on, further reactions would produce a unification of the original thesis and of its antithesis to produce a new synthesis, a new way of understanding, which itself would become over time a new thesis that would generate its antithesis and initiate this dialectical process all over again. Now, from this point of view then, the history of human progress could be understood as the unfolding of ideas from the inside out, an immanent process. This immanent is I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T, from the inside out. And importantly here, this philosopher, Hegel, he saw in the emergence and development of the rational Prussian bureaucracy the place, the location, the vehicle for the emergence of this distinctive human essence or spirit, which he called absolute reason. So in other words, in terms of Hegel's philosophy, and you can imagine yourself now as part of the German reading public, wondering, with understanding your history as a disorganized set of states inside of an empire whose international status was not always certain. Picture yourself now feeling excited, enthusiastic about redefining Germanness in a Prussian state, now able to understand yourself as on the leading edge of human development. The Prussian bureaucracy becomes the site for the unfolding of absolute reason. It's important to understand, and helpful, I think, to understand that the German language uses the same word here for mind and spirit. The word is Geist. So for Hegel, the history of the world was not just a disorganized collection of events, not history, as some people say, as simply one damn thing after another. History was a logical sequence of conflicts, a logical sequence of struggles, they would eventually lead to the full realization of the human spirit mind, human mind spirit. So he believed that the eventual unification of the Germanic states, the bringing together of the Germanic states into one modern German nation state, was the key pathway to the realization, the liberation of mind spirit, which he understood as absolute reason. So, in the process, now picture yourself as one of the Prussian nobility and even Austrian nobility, grappling with the emergence of these new concepts. From your point of view, the continuing development of rational bureaucratic institutions would ensure that reason would prevail over individual self-interest, and it would prevent the dangers of a war of all against all, or of the tyranny of an oppressor. At the same time, it would inhibit the development of democratic revolutions that might undermine your status. So, the prospect of unification thus provided Prussians and Germans with the means for bringing together the evolving image of progress, which I described as a shift from high culture to reason, bring together that image with the image of nationhood. Unification would make Germany the world center for human advancement and human progress. So these Prussian noblemen, if you're a Prussian nobleman, you're pleased with this image. You've come to believe, to understand that right here in Prussia, we have a state that's destined to lead both all German states and humanity in general, all without one of those messy popular revolutions. So, through the examples of Fichte and Hegel, we see a case where there's a unique relationship between philosophers, philosophy, and government. Accordingly, it's interesting to see that many German philosophers in this emergent German academy were working in government. They contrast with many philosophers in the so-called scientific revolution and the Enlightenment period, such as, let's say, the Frenchman Descartes and the Englishman Francis Bacon. These people who continue to enjoy the material benefits of patronage. The German philosophers, by contrast, had to find government jobs to support themselves. Many were thus very well positioned, not just to theorize the emergence of reason, to articulate the emergence of reason, but to practice it on the job as well. Hegel's philosophy helped to legitimize the Prussian government. Now, Hegel had a very famous student, and I want to step aside just for a moment to help you understand the relationship between the two. About this student, you know something. His name is Karl Marx. Karl Marx, a German theorist, a student of Hegel, importantly did most of his theoretical work in Great Britain in the middle 1800s. And it is often argued by philosophers that Marx turned Hegel on his head in emphasizing material relations and material forces in human development rather than the unfolding of mind spirit. After all, Marx here is the theorist of a proletarian revolution against capitalism. The working class must overcome the exploitation of the bourgeoisie, a point that is elaborated in the Soviet module in this class, in engineering cultures. And yet, at the same time, one could make the case that there was a significant connection between these two, the student and the teacher. Marx divided human history into stages himself, which he characterized as pre-capitalist formations, capitalist formations, and then the future, which he envisioned as socialist formations. The argument was that capitalism as a social form was getting in the way, in a sense, of human progress, because capitalism generated a class struggle between the new bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class, and the emergent working class, or the proletariat. Remember, he's in Great Britain, the center of the Industrial Revolution. And Marx's theory of value in capitalism, which became known as the labor theory of value, argued that capitalists exploited labor by alienating them from it, taking possession of the value that they produced, but paying them only a fraction of the value that they actually produced. So from this point of view, from Marx's point of view, the only way for humanity to continue advancing or to be fully realized in this German sense was through a revolution of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. Otherwise, exploitation would continue, the traditions of the past would continue, and reason would be stopped in its tracks. So in this sense, even while turning Hegel theoretically on his head because he focused on the material forces and relations of economic production, Marx was still participating in this German tradition, which is often characterized as German idealism, because it argued for and tried to theorize a distinctive approach to progress as emergence from something inside, because capitalism generated the contradictions that would ultimately come to transform it. Okay.